Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
This is the Open Source Report from WBRN Radio in Boston on the Boston Red Network on the 9th of January 2018. MA here is brought to you, of course, by Cranston Software. We partner with many others. Their particular information is very valuable here. The registry out of the UK, a very nice technical paper. We'll start off as we normally do with the kernel and where it is. It's very important here because of the meltdown bug and several other bugs. We're in bug. Well, we're just dealing with bugs here, I guess is one way of putting it. Let me just 1 second here. Have to take a non-commercial break. The latest kernel release, I'm just looking at it here, is 4.12, and that is on the 5th of January. There is a release candidate 7 out. This is 4.1.5 release candidate 7. The latest on it is the 7th. We are on the 9th now. Just thought we'd put that out. And for the Slackware part of this scenario, we're looking here at linuxquestions.org. Greg Hartman here on Meltdown, Spectre, and the Linux kernel. And we'll go to his blog. Nonetheless, Patrick of Slackware. This is the Slackware version. They are working on it, and many people are working on it. From Mr. Hartman here, he said, I'm glad there are a lot of very clever people working to resolve this. Also happy that most of the boxes at my company are AMD. The same here, we are AMD. I think I am down to a 9 or 10 Intel boxes. Yeah, we don't have... the only Intel box we have around is a notebook, and that is really not something that would affect us. Some AMD is also affected. We'll go through that, but let's go to his, Mr. Hartman's meltdown, the Spectre Linux kernel status. He just goes on to say, now everyone knows about the big just announced regarding the computer security hack. The Daily Mail even carries it. I'm always going into... I'm not going into detail about it. From the Zero project paper on the issue involved, they just gave out the 2018 awards right now. that's amazingly good. If you want the technical details, you can go to this site. We'll post this up, and we're going to Mr. Cribbs on security, and we'll find out all about this. If your Linux systems are running a normal Linux distributions, go update your kernel. They should all have updates in them, and keep updating them over the next few weeks. The Slackware depositories are very good at this, updating the kernel. That means the latest kernel is 4.14, and release at this moment in time is 4.14.12. So any of these are obviously out there. Some additional fixes are needed for some systems that have boot time problems with 4.1, 4.21. We had a brief problem with that, which has been fixed there. Linus, of course, is working on this. David Hassan and various others are working on it, fix and emerging upstream in form there from the old long-term stable kernel. We've leaned heavy on the work of Hugh Dickens and Dave Hansen, etc. And they do have a long-term kernel out there. Some people are running it, and the 4.14 and 4.15, that will be the new kernel, are there are different bugs right now. We know some ADSO versions that are getting worked on here, and you're going to go into much on this if you rely on any of these kernel trees other than a 4.4, 4.9, or 4.1, 4 now, right now. You do not have a distribution supporting you, and you're out of luck. Well, and the ARM64, this is some patches for the meltdown right now, are for the meltdown issue, are not merging into the Linux tree. They are staged and ready to be merged in release candidate 4.16 once 4.15 is released in a few weeks. So these are coming up. Android, I pointed out the Android common kernel tree. The ARM fixes have been merged into 3.18 and 4.4 and the 4.9 branches there. We'll get to Android in a minute here. Spectra, again, if you're running a distribution kernel, you might be covered, as some of the distributions have merged various patches into them, including Slackware. Upstream, well, the status is there is no fix merged into upstream trees there. So some things, proposed solutions are not trivial, but some are amazingly good. Paul Turner's example of some of the concepts being created to help resolve the issue. So a lot of people working on this. And in conclusion here, again, update your kernel. Don't delay. Don't stop. Update to resolve problems will be continuing for some time. The long-standing kernel releases are totally independent of these types of issues. So keep up to date always. One of the issues out there, let's go more into this without wanting to spend too much time here. This is from the Register UK. More stuff broken amidst Microsoft's efforts to fix meltdown Spectra situation here. Things do get break. It's not unusual with patches for things to get Pulse Secure virtual client and a sandbox. The sandbox has isolated the program developed by Sofio Secure has come up with a workaround for affected platforms, including 10. This is Windows 10, Windows 8.1, and not 7. Sandbox has released an update client to solve compatibility issues with the emergency fix from Microsoft. Compatibility with the same set of Microsoft fixes released last week. That would be on the 3rd of January. Froze some PCs and AMD chips. These sorts of issues leave system administrators to the lesser extent between the rock and a hard place. Critical meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities recently found in Intel chips and some other CPUs to a lesser extent. Unless the antivirus company's registry key is set, Windows updates will not deliver January's or any further security updates. Sometimes that's a good thing. Support article clarifies that customers will not receive the January 2018 security updates or any substantial security updates, and will not be protected from unless their antivirus vendor sets a particular registry key. One of the strange things there with these particular people. Now let me go back here. We'll keep on this. Security holes in AMD CPUs, hidden secure processor code revealed ahead of patches. This is out of San Francisco on the 6th of January. Security researcher from Google's cloud security team on Wednesday disclosed a vulnerability of the AMD platform security processor, as that is PSP, which resides in the 64-bit 886 processor, provides administrative functions similar to management engine in Intel. The FTMP is a firmware implementation of the trusted platform module, a security-oriented microcontroller specification. Cohen said he reported the flaw to AMD in September of last year. Now the 90-day disclosure window has passed seemingly without any action by AMD about the flaw made public. The firmware update emerged from some AMD chips, in mid-December. An option at least partially disables PSP. Intel was one of the first to come out with this. It explains that PSP refers to AMD's security technology that monitors security environments for processes, managing the boot process and utilizing security mechanisms checked for suspicious activity. So it includes an embedded ARM microcontroller, cryptographic coprocessor, local memory registers interface, and not to mention the environmental management control block that oversees the processor security checking when it runs. The trusted execution environment are Trustinet. Anyway, this is some of what is going on here. The flaw identified through the manual static analysis involves a stack block overflow in one of the functions here. Unlike some CPUs, the PSP doesn't implement common exploited migration techniques such as stack cookies, no execute flags, etc. Won't get much into this, but Cohen's post describes the vulnerability as a remote code execution flaw. However, the physical access is a prerequisite. In email to the registry, excuse me, The CTO of Secure Biz capsuled said the vulnerability isn't quite subject to remote execution since the crafted certificate that exploits the vulnerability needs to be written to the NVRAM. The attacker must already have privileges to access the hosts. Are that AMD spokesman told the registry that the attacker would first have to gain access to the mainboard, then to the SPI flash before the issue could be exploited. AMD plans to address the situation. Qualcomm is another one here. Joins Intel, ARM, and everyone else. Suffered a hack bug 2. This is on the 6th of January. Qualcomm has confirmed its processors have the same security vulnerability described by the others. The tech giant packed favored Friday news dump. In other words, Friday news dump's been long in the U.S. here. ARM's compatible Snapdragon system on chip, newly released Synchronous server-grade processors are subject to meltdown R2 Spectra data feed bugs. Anyway, Qualcomm Technology is aware of the problem, providing technology for that support robust security and privacy, and is a priority for them. Well, evidently it's a priority if anyone wants to stay in business. Qualcomm declined to comment any further on precisely which of the three CVE listed vulnerabilities its chips were subject to, or to give any details there. Qualcomm uses a mixture of customized, off-the-shelf ARM cores and homegrown ARM-compatible CPU products, which drive tons of ARM Cortex-A and Cortex-U CPUs. Nonetheless, it will use its A5 core for its Snapdragon 845 and other Snapdragon lines list anyway where they are. They're all over the place. CPUs were this is Spectrum meltdown patches are available. Are incoming for iOS. The iGiant Intel base Mac also needs the latest Mac version, that is 10.13.2 are graded to kill the meltdown attack. So we finally find a little bit about that. Meanwhile, IBM said firmware updates would arrive next week for its power PCUs to address the Spectre-like bug. So let's back up just a little bit here. Well, wait a minute. Let's go to Mr. Cribs here, where we started this out actually with Mr. Cribs somewhere here. Scary chip flaw raises spectrum of meltdown, and this is he put this out. Let's see, on the looks like the 8th here. It's going effectively the same way. Talking about the meltdown, we used it in the last program. Meltdown and Spectre. Found at many of these sites. We will append this. The Android bulletin here issued on the 2nd and updated on the 5th. Patches are available there. Android's open source project repository, and link from this bulletin. Check and update your Android version if you have that. Android platforms here, Google Play. Migrations, there's no report of active customer problems there. Android, Google Service, the Android security platform, and service protection, such as Google Play protection. These capabilities reduce the likelihood of having a problem with Android. Several other vulnerabilities in this section could. These are some level patches here that Android has put out. We won't spend a lot of time on them. Microsoft's Meltdown patch has little impact on storage applications. This is from Tom's Hardware. The Meltdown and Spectre exploits have made mainstream news over the past 3 days. Now, we're not here to downplay it. Early testing from the Biosphere shows storage performance falling victim to Microsoft's earlier patch. We talked 20 to 30% problem there. We chose the Intel Optum 900P to measure the impact of the patch. And there was very little impact there on the solid state drives running the tests. And let me finish this article up here. A difference came in Adobe Photoshop's heavy workload that takes more than 5 minutes to complete. They recorded a 1/10 second differentiation there. Yeah. Anyway, some of the things, Project Zero, that was referred to. This is at Google. This is by Jan Horn. We discovered the CPU data cache. Timing could be abused to affect leak data or specific. Let's see here. Misspeculated execution here. Variants of the issue are known to affect many CPUs. Again, this is the ARMs, the AMDs, period. During the course of our research, we developed the following proofs of concepts here. I won't go into what Horn is talking about. Intel's software developers manual. This is more of the technical part here. The Harwell branch prediction intervals. That's one of Intel's chips there. I haven't seen that in a long time around. But they all, as they say, pop up here. Reading a host memory from KVM, loading. This is the loading the host kernel. Looking back, this is unnecessarily complicated, but it's a nice demonstration that various techniques can use. A simple way could be first determine the address of the VM Linux. Now, this is for the Linux kernel. We'll go ahead and put Mr. Horn up there, period, and Cyberus technology, the meltdowns attack of general memory data security of computers with Intel x86 architecture. The rumor factory's already been working overtime for about a week, and now lots of IT blogs and online newspapers have written about it. No doubt about that. The exploit, in short, is possible to exploit the speculative execution of x86 processes in order to read arbitrary kernel memory. Thomas Pruscher and Warner Haas, two of the founders of cyber security technology, were amongst the first to discover the bug. That was on January the 3rd. And a summary of what the security bug means. It exploits the code in Windows, Linux, etc., as this is not a software but a hardware issue. It's possible to dump arbitrary kernel memory with on a privileged user space applications. Reading kernel memory implies reading the memory of the whole system on most 64-bit systems, i.e. also memory from address spaces of other processes. Fully virtualized machines are not affected. Guest user space could still read from guest user kernel space, but not from the host kernel space. That would apply to certain others. Paro virtualization of machines are affected, and Zen PV is one there. Container solutions like Docker, OpenZ are equally affected. Linux, Kaiser Patch, migrate, meltdown effects on Linux. Most modern processors, particularly with the Intel, since 2010 are affected. There's no evidence that this attack is successfully deployed on ARM or AMD, although the underlying principles apply to all contemporary superscalar CPUs. Meltdown is distant from the Spectre attack, which became public at the same time. So this is from them and some examples of it. The technical background in a nutshell: Meltdown effectively overcomes the kernel space or user space memory isolation barriers on the x86 machine. The access happened indirectly by exploiting subchannel information that is inadvertently made available by the cache after the speculative execution of a prepared instruction stream that is executed out of order. The root cause of the problem is a combination of the following subset of a processor's micro architecture, noting none of the individual components is to blame for the vulnerability. Here's how it works. Virtual memory mapping from virtual to physical address enables the operating system to isolate processes sparsely from each other, and on top of that, the operating system can define which range of memory view is accessible by user application in order to secure the kernel memory from unauthorized access. This protection is only actually getting a bypass. Memory cache: some memory access is generally slow compared to the pace of the CPU. Often access memory is transparently cached in order to accelerate a program execution. Speculative execution, on the other hand, from a macroscopic view, Spectre scalar process still executes machine code instructions sequentially on the other hand, from a microscopic view, the contemporary design relaxes the order in which the instruction sequence is processed. So we have a macro and a micro here. Get those straight. Superscalar CPU has multiple process units and can perform logic and arithmetic actions as well as load store units with instructions split in those atomic parts. We won't get much into this, but it does. The first instruction is tied to access 1 byte of memory at an instruction that resides within the protected kernel space in order to load into the processor's registry. The affected instruction is generally a page fault because the normal user space applications are not allowed to access kernel memory. This is a very good explanation here of what is going on. The Kaiser patch they're talking about, this is from Cyberus Technology. So we'll place this in as a part of our rundown on the meltdown. Anyway, the open source inside of the open source story in 2007, unquestionably Canonical's decision to stop developing the Unity desktop. So what they've done is they moved to Gomi's shell desktop. They should have done this a very, very long time ago. So Canonical pulled Ubuntu 17.10 downloads from its website last month due to a bug. There evidently had problems with Acer and with Dell. The bug is a result of Canonical's decision to enable the Intel SPI driver and to allow a BIOS firmware updates. Meanwhile, repercussions of Canonical's move to Gomi are still being felt in the open source world. I believe this continues to be one of the big stories of 2018. Secondly, perhaps a much bigger reason for Ubuntu's without Unity will continue to be a big story in the foreseeable future is that Ubuntu using the Gomi shell almost making the shell a de facto standard on the Linux desktop. Because the reason there is because Ubuntu is the largest segment of the Linux desktop. Fedora's a download page, the Debian download page, default link will get you the Gomi shell. We're still running Kali in Slackware. I've always liked the Gomi over Kali. The uniqueness of Gomi is something that hasn't been the case previously. It may not be good news for Kali fans, but believe it's going to be a profound impact on the future of the desktops. No doubt about that. Huge story has been a huge story in the 2017 de facto standards. Say Windows are a Mac OS. So this will. The idea is to bring the Linux desktop in with Windows and the Mac OS. I've never liked the Mac OS since the 80s. The development tools in Gomi, particularly in the APIs and the Gomi Builder tool, have arrived early this year in 3.20 out there. Now potential Utopia has some downsides already noted. That leaves Kali fans time out, a little out in the cold, I should say. Yeah, no doubt about it. Arch Linux, this is evidently his favorite, with Flatpak and Snappaks having more or less eliminated the need for the Arch user depository. And then here we come also Amazon's Linux 2, Amazon's new homegrown Linux distribution, loosely seen there, while the Linux 2 stream vendors lock into anyway. It appears that limited testing to offer some advantages over other images on EC2. Anyway, the speed of it there. Put it out here. Anyway, the last story worth seeing is an eye on Foxfire, the once and possibly future darling of the open source developers. This is Foxfire, 57 with the quantum code rewritten, perhaps the most impressive since 1. There. But anyway, they had Mr. Robot. The promo fiasco. Yeah, it was a fiasco, and some other things also in that are fiascos, and that's trying to raise money for the project. A mistake there, and it caused some problems with those Foxfire users, no doubt. Now let me. Okay. And we'll close out here the new age of Develop Ops, rethinking your open source use policy. This is from InfoWorld on the 2nd of January. I spoke with someone the other day who was fired from his job as a technical product manager after 20 years of experience. He is now job searching, but finding it difficult. There's a new bar set for speed of technology development that capsizes on Agile. We've talked a little here about Agile software development processes and leveling open source technologies. Two things that were not taken seriously just 10 years ago. I can remember in 2000, we were doing a lot of work at the time at Cranston in Agile software development. Anyway, according to 69% of senior executives, this digital transformation is focusing us now to rethink our cybersecurity strategies to accommodate these constraints from management. Developers have turned more and more to open source code as great assets to building products and features, as opposed to writing code from scratch. Open source technology is available openly from the internet through GitHub, and SourceForge open source now makes up 90% of the code composition of modern applications. Dealing with the flood of potentially risky external code into our websites and applications needs to be addressed through management directed use policies. These policies need to protect the organization from cybersecurity threats and potential lawsuits. Lawsuits are very important there. We talked last year a little bit about open source projects and where they were in court with some of the quote-unquote proprietary vendors putting open source into their products and licensing situation. We'll get into that in another program. This is important. 50% of code developers incorporate at least 5 new open source projects into their work each month, but enforcing use policy ensures that the safe use of open source can be quite hard. We surveyed a wide range of professional developers to get a better idea of the current state of open source. We found that 25% of developers claim their employers do not have guidelines for using open source. And on the other side of the spectrum, 15% were extremely dissatisfied with strict policies enforced by their companies. Consequence of no policy, having an open source policy becomes a liability of not having for a company, no doubt about that. 30% of successful breach strike at application layer of a company. These applications are typically company websites where consumers can log in and store an account. Since 90% of modern applications are made up of open source, it is a huge liability to not to know what the components are. The consequences of a strict policy. On the flip side, having too strict a policy on an open source user becomes a liability for companies because of the labor needed and the time spent. This is the big problem right there. Not reinvent the mousetrap. Equilibrium, they advised. Cybersecurity is a franchise vulnerability risk, but should be talked about by executives there, and most executives don't have a clue. The conclusion here is open source is an amazing asset that putting everyone on even a playing field. That is one of the advantages of it. We saw that at Cranston back in the late 80s when we started with shareware. Shareware code was shared, and it was for the most part, proprietary code by a lot of very small developers. But it was inexpensive, and you could buy licenses for it, or you could just take it, as many people did. And we also sold toolkits for Minix and several others that became Linux. And when the Linux kernel came, we popped into the what's known as the open source movement, and we were always supported the open source foundation in Boston. Anyway, nonetheless, now we're progressing to liberate software. That's free software. More and more of it is out here. And this is basically what they're talking about. Now, there are different open source licenses, but there's no doubt that people go to GitHub, get code out of there, and they sometimes credit it to the author, the owner, depending on which license they appear. There are a lot of different licensing operations out there. So this is our little roundup here. We went from the open source to Gomi and Ubuntu, and we start, incidentally, with the late Nelson Mandela talking about the concept of Ubuntu. It's a community concept. We just finished a Kwanzaa, a community exercise in the African community in the U.S. and in the diaspora. But with Ubuntu, anybody can participate in this community giving back process, which is all of what GitHub is about. And we have now seen the results of this movement, of the code being out there. And there's very, very little code that is originally written, because you can take a piece of an open source project and improve upon it, and depending on the license, give it back to the community, and with your improvements, and some are limited. We'll do a segment again and bring this licensing thing up, because some are under the Apache license there, which is a little different license, and there are several open source licenses out there, so you need to know which license you're under. And depending on, obviously, the size of the corporation, many times legal advice is necessary there. But if it's a startup project, that is a little different kind of situation. You can more or less deal with that as it comes about. So the case of the 20-year man, he's out of it. But part of his problem is not only dealing with open source. He evidently did not get into the world of agile development, which even Microsoft, when we used to do a .NET, they were forced into Agile. But now what has happened is, going to the clouds, you're seeing Agile, and you have new actors that were not in there. Amazon, it's Linux out there. Oracle has a Linux, don't hear much about it. But there are desktop Linux distributions out there, many of them out there, including our Slackware out there. Mint, we were going to talk about Mint. Mint has a new one out called, Sovier, I believe, is what Mint's new technology is called. We'll try to put it up and see where we go on it as we move down the information highway. Now, okay, this will do it for us. This is our open source report on the 9th of January 2018. The first one for 2018, we did a little roundup of 2017 in our report. And of course, we went to the kernel meltdown, which as consumers doesn't affect them, but IT shops, it does affect them, and also some machinations in the cloud, depending on what you are running there, containers like Docker, etc., or if you're running Zen or whatever you're running there, you need to check into some of the articles and technical articles that we post here. Have a good day.